Again, thank you and welcome for joining this session. It's the first session, Reimagining Housing. For the last few days and maybe weeks, I've been bombarding my colleague with emails, telling him about the session, what we should do and how we should put it. And we decided at the end that it would come as a natural evolution for the session. In this session, we have prepared, the people in the session or the participants of the session have prepared a wonderful presentation to share with you. Yes, definitely. And starting with the introduction of the session, so we have 10 minutes for introduction. We have a small breaking the ice type of exercise. Then we have 45 minutes for the first theme of the session, where we discuss beyond standardization, where we have two presentations by Aboli and myself, then few questions to discuss received from a survey we sent for the partner organization as well as the participants. Then the next session, part of the session or the next theme to be discussed is the resident need in transition, which is also for 45 minutes, where we see our colleague Saskia and Noémi presenting on social housing and housing in Europe. But then we have 20 minutes as a conclusion, where collaboratively work to produce the session. Thank you, Leon.
Our panel speakers, the experts who will also share these sessions. So I would maybe ask them to introduce themselves. So maybe we'll start with Eleanor Warwick.
I can shout really loudly.
This is for recording.
Oh, this is the recording. Oh, okay. Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Eleanor Warwick. I work for England's largest housing association for the moment. I lead the strategy, policy and research team there.
Good morning. I'm Bruno Sauer, CEO Green Building Council in Spain. So we are working constantly and transforming the building market on national level, but into international context. I mean, we are part of the World Green Building Council movement, which is 75 councils all worldwide working on sustainability.
Good morning. I'm Eira Capelán. I am the program lead for development for South Yorkshire Housing Association, a in South Yorkshire medium developer, in the context of the UK, quite a small registered provider for affordable housing. Anyone else? That's it. That's us. Sharing.
So now I ask you to take off your phones, scan the code, if you can, or you can go to the menti.com and use this code, where in that page or that website, we would like to ask you what innovative approaches have you encountered or implemented in your practices. That type of question help us to set dimension and boundary. And congratulations, we have first entry, LCC valuing. Life's cost cycle valuing. And if we can continue to add to this session, to the answer to this question. I think we are running a little bit behind the time, but that's okay. We can always take out of the conclusion. So please take your time while answering these questions. It's okay. Okay. Gradual evolution of modern method of construction in all its forms. I think that's a novel approach. I guess it's an innovative approach, modern method of construction, despite maybe the vagueness on how to define modern method of construction and how it works. The DDS, I have no idea what's that. Design Decision Support System. Building performance evaluation. So thank you for answering those questions. We will get back to them at the end, of course. Now we're moving to the first part of the session, which is beyond standardization. And here I borrowed the terminology standardization from Eira. You mentioned it in your question. So we start with Aboli. So please, if you want to start. You have your slide on the presentation, but please, if you want.
Hello, everyone. My name is Aboli Mangire, and I'm very happy to present part of my doctoral research that I'm doing at HafenCity University in Hamburg in Germany. And although, yeah, I'm focusing on an Indian case study, so even though it's not an European case study like most of your projects or all of your projects, but yeah, I'm hopeful that it offers some insights into your research and practice. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so my main research question is, what are the opportunities and obstacles of contemporary social mass housing in India with regard to passive cooling design and green spaces? In my research, I'm trying to address an environmental issue of rising temperature or heat waves. No, I think, just stay, I can tell you. Yeah. Environmental issue of rising temperature or heat waves. I'm analyzing the spatial elements such as cantilever balcony, inner courtyards, void decks, and types of green spaces within these elements. To do so, a conceptual framework of socio-spatiality is used, which combines the spatial data such as building form and layout, shading devices, green space design, and the social data of lived experience, spatial use, and forms of greening by the inhabitants. My particular research interest in this work is to contribute to the expansion of architectural methodologies, which are increasingly seen as an important research area in the face of climate change. Next, please. So I carried out fieldwork in the social mass housing project in the metropolitan region in India near Mumbai. The desk research, ethnographic surveys, observations, and interviews with the construction professionals. They provided empirical evidence to establish findings, which are briefly discussed here in 3 categories. Next, please. So, adequate, safe, and thermally conscious design due to standardization. So the advantages can be named as cantilevered spaces of corridors, private green refuge in a cantilevered balcony, airflow quality, improved airflow quality because of the passive cooling elements such as corridors and balconies, and more like courtyards. Then provision of private toilet. It sounds very basic, but this is also important to mention that, yeah, the slum dwellers did not have it before. So this is also a step up. Earthquake-resistant construction, structural quality control, fast construction, and less skilled labor is also used because of this technology. So in the first pillar or column, they are more the advantages. In the middle, or the second one, is the structural limitations to the future of bottom-up greening. Because of the full concrete shear walls, construction acts as a serious restriction for large trees and to any other space adaptation for the future. And so that's more like the restriction for future of greening. And the third one is methodological insight, which allowed me to engage the residents in the process. Different insights into long-term sustainability or unsustainability, let's say, such as restricted greening future, spatial inflexibility, lack of economic incentives for greening, and short-term welfare, such as a slum-free cities mission and home ownership. So methodologically speaking, it offered a cross-sectional view of material and social aspects of social housing. Yeah, next. Thank you for your attention. Yeah, and I mean, it was really a challenge to fit it in the 3 minutes, and I so I feel invited to read the abstract that I provided. Yes.
So maybe it's now my turn to introduce my co-leader of the session, because he's also presenting his PhD. So Mahmoud will talk about exploring the building blocks of sustainable social housing frameworks. So
thank you,
please.
Leonardo, thank you very much, and thank you, Aboli. As Leonardo explained the title, you can read the extended abstract with the proceeding of this conference. I'm not going to go for the technical detail of that. Well, I'm going to say that we don't have a problem with the framework. We have enough of framework. Unlike vitamin D, we don't have deficiency in frameworks and the plenty of frameworks. In that paper, in this concept, we're trying to say that to move from current housing sector, what we face now, to future housing sector, we need to see what different type of framework already exists, and there's a plenty of a framework that already exists. I try to visualize here that there is an arrow that takes you from point A to B. That means the framework and how it leads you from one point to another in different context. For the context of there's a framework for well-being, there's regulation about well-being, there's a framework for sustainability, energy cost, and so on and so forth. Then what we're arguing for the sake of frameworks in our extended abstract to say that we need to, we're not proposing a framework, just to clarify, to put it out there. We're not proposing any type of framework. We're not saying this is the best framework or this is how to build a framework. We're saying that in order to address the frameworks or to think about frameworks, we were able to identify, by we I mean Professor Karim, Hadjri, and Dr. Krzysztof, that we were able to identify 4 types of components that we think, we argue for that essential in frameworks. Those components are the well-being, and its secondary component, like the social benefit, the traditional definition of the social housing as around the 4 feature of social housing. The second component that we believe it's important, we argue that it's important, is sustainability. So when we talk about the future social housing, we need to talk about sustainability in addition to its secondary component like energy efficiency, emission reduction, resource control, resource management, nature of preserving the balance of the nature with the built environment. The third component is the economic component, where we also argue for the sake of future framework that we should look into the economic aspects of the building, but not from the typical social science perspective of economic. We argue for the maintenance cost, the running cost of the building, that any framework, and we suggest that any framework should consider these aspects. In the last 20 seconds, the last component that we're arguing for is the authority. So if you remember what I was saying in the morning, that the complexity of regulation made it almost impossible to follow that regulation. So it should be in mind when developing a framework, the level of complexity and the level of clarity in regulation that addresses the environmental sustainability of social housing. With that, I conclude that in order to develop any future framework, we suggest, we don't have an answer, a definite answer, that those are the main component that should be included, and this is the way it could take us from the current housing sector and its challenges to the future housing sector and a possible solution for it. Thank you. That's it. Thank you. Thank you.
So now we would like to have a discussion. So, and that's why the presentations are so brief, because we would like actually to have an open discussion here and maybe share experiences and good practices. So the idea is, or the main 2 questions that we would like to address in this part of the session is: how do we best ensure that standardization intended to improve scheme viability remains contextually responsive to the needs of customers and community? So again, these attention and focus on residents' needs. And then secondly, what are the main challenges of existing housing stock in European cities and internationally in terms of climate emergencies, such as rising temperature and energy usage?
I think while we will trying to answer this question, having a debate, we could not have an answer at the end. It's a debate about this question. We ask everyone to scan the code again. It's Menti, and just share terminology or term that I've been using in this debate, so it could help us to conclude. So maybe we can start with Eleanor, starting with the first question.
I think, and I was the person responsible for the point about modern methods of construction in all its forms. I think we have to think about the granularity of standardisation and what do we mean, because we have neighbourhoods which are delivered at a sort of like a master planning level, where we can have incredible sort of like standardization of housing types, either as sort of like terrace housing or mass housing or sort of things in terms of that. We can have standardization in terms of, at the very other end of the scale, in terms of layouts of flats and particular layouts. And I think that's really important when we need to think about some of the challenges of how do we extend the idea of universal design and making sure that we have layouts which are accessible. You know, standardization shouldn't be the going down to the bottom. It should be about how to improve accessibility sort of like for everybody. And then we have that sort of like in-between bit. How do we use standardization to actually improve the customization, to improve the sort of like bespokeness? And I think we can do that in the component level, and I think we're getting really good. And I'm not even just thinking about sort of like pods, but that whole sort of like sense of what are the elements what we're sort of like standardizing on. I think the bit that we need more thinking is what are the consequences, what are the decisions that we make when we're looking at particular layouts, particular standard house types. I'm also really interested, having done a lot of work with volume house builders, and they talk a lot about we have to have a standard house type because that's how we know how many units we can get on. That's how we know we can work out the viability. And if you actually look at their standard house types, they're all tweaked and slightly different depending on the market, depending on the tenure, depending on, construction materials. So I think the question, to make sure it's contextually responsive, is we need a better understanding about what we mean about standardization.
It's tricky. Speaking in a microphone is not amplifying your voice. It's a little bit strange. Standardization, it's one of these constant instruments that we use to transform market. It's not the only one. It's a powerful one for sure. It can be a powerful one, but can also be a restrictive one. It's not because you standardize that you reach quality. That's one of these things. I mean, standardization most of the times goes against individualization, and everybody wants to have his own house. What we use or what we work on recently quite a lot is on the debate on how do you standardize certain things, speaking in our environmental impacts on a long-term vision. We are trying to connect constantly the social aspect of climate change and climate change impact, material problems with standardization, in the sense that if Europe, and I'm speaking in the European context, I'm sorry for the broader international context is different. But if in the European context, Europe is asking for instance, material passport of buildings, that means that in 40 years you have to know which materials in which building present. So if you standardize structures, I mean, physically speaking of buildings, if you standardize structures, all the rest should be somewhere the new provider of materials for the future. That means that constantly you can improve dwellings or offices, we're speaking now about housing, you can improve it adapting to the needs of individual people. So you have a standardization, but it has to make it possible to individualize needs. That's one aspect, and we are insisting quite a lot on that, because probably if you're able, and that's why I wrote before life cycle cost valuing, because if you look on long term, then probably the financial problem of materials and industrialization or standardization will be lower if you look to the long term. But you have to be able to recover these things. So if we work on standardization, it has to be done constantly looking to the future. I mean, it is not something that you for just today. It is an instrument that should be able to make it flexible, a flexible use, but optimizing resources in the future. If it's done in that way, I completely agree. If it's becoming something very restrictive on the moment itself, because you have to fit in certain things temporarily, I think probably for the future is going to be a problem.
Wow. Super interesting. So I'm responsible for this question, and have now been given loads of food for thought. So my mind is kind of spinning a little bit, but in the most positive possible way. I think this question for me arose from a little side quest that I have at work, which is, specifically looking into how we can best use house types for our upcoming development projects. And my fear and the risk that I see with that is that is something that I see with UK house building a lot, and it is this idea that you standardize everything, and what you lose is that ability, I suppose, to adapt to customer needs or to community needs. Particularly, I think, in communal spaces between housing, I think those are severely disadvantaged in UK developing housing developments. Having said that, I see a lot of advantages, especially in terms of viability of standardizing. So to date, what we have done at South Yorkshire Housing Association has worked with the notion of archetypes rather than set house types. So an example would be, for instance, a panelized MMC system is something that we have looked into, or a volumetric MMC system, and we've looked at that as an archetype that we then explore for each site. So we look at the sites and we go, is this a traditional brick and block build? Is this a volumetric MMC build? Is this a one of these pods that you drop down? And that has to some extent been helpful, but I don't think it reaches the granular level of detail of community kind of grit that you really want to respond to kind of contextual needs. So, I mean, obviously, because I asked the question, I have zero answer to the question. But these are kind of the thoughts, I suppose, that that informed it originally. And I really appreciate the answers from colleagues.
I just would like to raise one question. I mean, it's an interesting item. I was wondering if there is a common debate going on aren't we over-standardizing certain things? Do you really believe that standardization is the solution, or is just one of the instruments? I think that's a crucial question, because otherwise we speak more than standardization. We speak about industrialization, and I'm really, really tired of that discussion. So in that sense, standardization in terms of norms, regulations, all these things, sometimes it's so restrictive to be creative for new forms, new ways of housing, new ways of urban planning, that I'm sometimes afraid of that discussion. But it is an important instrument, but we should be able to limit it somewhere.
Fundamentally agree and appreciate the challenge as well. I think as Mahmoud, who's done a secondment with us, will know, standardization is not our forte at SYHA. I think we could use a bit more of it, because we tend to be very much focused on each individual site. We lose a lot of time, we lose a lot of energy. Sometimes we invest enormous amounts of money just on that kind of granular, specific detail. So I think this idea of having a structure that best allows you to allow for flexibility, if that makes sense, which is, I think, what you were saying as well, to allow kind of conscious thought to be focused on the particularities of the site or the community, and still be able to kind of deliver, because as with, I imagine, most house builders in Europe, we are under pressure financially at the moment. It's hard work. So yeah, I think so. And I actually thought that one of the presentations from this morning of mass customization, Carolina, was, to me, really kind of resonated with this question as well. I just thought it was an interesting response to this particular predicament. I think you... Yeah.
I was going to pick up the mass customization as well, but I did want to add another sort of like fuel to the fire, and it's based on, I was a co-editor for a special edition of Buildings and Cities Journal sort of like 2 summers ago with Sophie Pelsmaker, which was looking at adaptable, adjustable, flexible housing, and alongside that we've spent a lot of time thinking about actually what are the tweaks we need, how much do we need to be able to adjust things, who are the people who need to be able to sort of stay, and that came back to sometimes thinking just having that bit of slack space. That's why some of the sort of like the terraced housing, the Georgian housing, the Parker Morris sort of space standards that we've had have given that ability to make those tweaks as people's lives has changed, as we've had to sort of like adapt, and I think we need to have a way of not standardizing which cuts that off. And I do agree, there's something about the way that we get shrink wrapped pattern types, proposals, which we have to have some degree of that to sort of like deliver, but I think we have to we are limiting sort of like too many of the options to do that, and we need to sort of like say what is the potential future adaptability of this in lots of different sort of like ways, environmentally, socially, stuff to do with sort of like not just thinking of it in spatial terms, which I think will be really sort of critical.
I think that's brilliant. I think that this is really put the context to the debate we're having, or the answer to the question we're having. Anyone would like to? Yes, definitely. I'm gonna pass the mic to you, Krzysztof. I'm sorry. I'm just gonna do this.
I'm not housing expert, so but I think that to me the discussion is kind of missing the point, to be honest. And it's very important. The question, what standardization means. It's in the foundation of that. Your answer were brilliant, and they are answering this question to some extent. But to me, there's really a challenge between the long-term policy that they are embedded in standardization, in particular norms, particular kind of achievable goals, and then you have short-term policies related to political, cycle. That kind of every 4 or 5 years, the government is changing, and then they have new stupid ideas, and then the massive pressure from market forces. So I would definitely defend standardization and normatives, especially in a kind of being European and living in a British context. Oh, come on, there's no comparison. Sorry, for my British colleagues, but British housing is rubbish. There's no comparison to Europe. I live in one, yeah. So it's not your, not your doing. So to me, I'm definitely in favor of standardization in that meaning exactly as you describe, as creating particular goals, or trying to achieve particular goals, but it's a long-term thinking. And I think that the presentation, the title of your presentation was very important. The time as an element of what we are discussing, what we are thinking is absolutely crucial here. Yeah? So standardization in this kind of 20th century meaning, there's industrialization, blah blah. It's rubbish. It's completely irrelevant. But the standardization that you discuss as a tool to achieve certain political or goals, this is the key.
I don't think all British housing is particularly terrible stuff. I've actually designed some houses, and they're not so bad.
Okay, so all apart from this that you designed.
One comment one point I was interested in was to do with this idea of lifetime homes and thinking about how we design. As an architect, my interest is how do we future-proof? Standardization is one thing, but then there's how society lives in housing. And lifetime homes, that concept that you design, that it can then accommodate people as they're over their lifetime. And of course, there have been initiatives in the UK, like Building for Life and all of these schemes that have been around to try and ensure that there are sort of general principles that you use when you're designing houses. And I think we do need to think that as people live in a home, and if they want to stay there for the duration of their whole life, their considerations and their requirements will change. And I think being able to design with that in mind is really important if we want sustainable communities, because that sustainability isn't about financial, it's about being able to stay in your home from 9 to 90. So when you become elderly and you need some support, and if we don't think about that, then that starts to impact the sustainability, the social sustainability of our housing.
I think we should move on to the next question, which is from our colleague Aboli. Would you like to start giving a context to the question? Then we can think, because now we just understood that standardization is one of the challenges, is a challenge in itself. It's not even a solution. It could be a tool, it could be a solution, but it's still a challenge. So probably if you can give a context to the question, then we can open it for the debate. It would be great. Sorry.
I think, personally speaking, through my research so far in 2 years, I think standardization has its benefits, and so far I've come come across more the benefits than the problems, I think. But that could be that could change. I don't know. So far, so much is the story. But I think about my question, probably it also then pretty much relates with the standardization of housing provision. Is that, and I also like what you said that. Like when we talk about standardization, we should look in the future. And now I have another question then because of that, but I'll focus on this. So I think, because I think climate emergencies are pretty much there in the future. And I don't think anyone has yet comprehended in the present, like what does it look like in the future, because we don't know yet. The heat waves are coming and going, and each year they're intensifying, and we don't know what we are doing about it, other than suffering from it. So, so when we look in the future, so maybe I can also rephrase, if I may. So in terms of climate emergencies such as rising temperature, or maybe as I came to Barcelona, there's also a problem with water and basically the resources. How can we deal with such problems with the help of, now that we are talking about architects and architectural tools and methods, or that's my selfish motive, but are we integrating methodologies not just from architecture but also from climate scientists or building physicists who are doing a lot of good research, fundamental research in it, and does it stay in the research, or how can we really bring it into the housing provision? Sorry for a very long.
Anyone want to start? Saskia.
Yeah, Saskia, if it's yours.
Thank you for the question. It's a good question. For me, it's almost cut and dry, but it's also it's almost obvious, but it's also very complicated, because the main challenge is not relying so much on technology. Everything is all about technocentric, which brings into the next part of the discussion. But everything that we have right now, looking for impact to reduce the effects of the climate emergency, relies a lot on using the same amount of energy that we use now in ways of green growth, so that we don't want to change our habits. We don't want to change the way that we use buildings. We want to use them and occupy them in the same way, and have things charging at all hours of all days, put on our washing machines individually whenever we want, etc., etc. And we can't keep relying on the extraction of resources to solve the climate crisis through technology, because even if in the end PV cells give us some free energy, which is great, that relies on a long chain of carbon-intensive processes that are still impacting, having long-term effects and short-term effects on the climate emergency cumulatively. People are still dying mining resources. Lithium batteries are going to end up in recycling. Unrecyclable lithium batteries are going to end up in waste. But we still keep trying to chase the use of energy through the same amount of use of energy through technocentric methods. And I think that we need to look back at the past and the way that people looked at buildings through ventilating through passive techniques and using resources and circulation, and looking at what we have and how can we impact heating and ventilation by just slowing down and stopping our consistent extraction of resources so that we can keep up with the pace of life that has been accumulated since the Industrial Revolution. It's just not sustainable. So for me, the main challenge is, I suppose, huge structural change. But yeah, just stop mining resources and looking at technocentric solutions to the climate emergency, because it's not going to work. It's just, we're burying ourselves and everyone else along with us.
Just to maybe introduce yours again, because I was checking the abstract that you sent it, and you were actually looking at those passive solutions and more, let's say, vernacular knowledge that people in India have been putting in place for so long, and now, because again, that technocentric focus that we have, the states that you were showing us are basically copying what we did in the 20th century here in Europe and overlooking what you already know over there. So I think I wanted to hear what you had to say about that.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, because I was going to respond to your comment or statement with something similar to what Leonardo has said. Yeah, I mean, maybe what I would like to say is that about that first is that, I also in agreement that how we use technology and what do we term technology or technocratic solution can also be very misleading sometimes. Or what I meant in my question was more that, let's say, building physicists or climate researchers is more about how to improve the building stock and the building design, but still using the old methods. Maybe that was the main part that I probably missed out on. But yeah, like Leonardo said, I also am doing passive cooling design and then going back to the old techniques, which were always probably they made more sense, perhaps. But yeah, like again, drawing on this question really is that like I'm personally curious to understand your view on what are the housing stock issues in Europe, and yeah, maybe something related to what has been said. So I think you have to.
Thank you. I think it's a brilliant question, and I think it's something that we're consistently discussing a lot at the minute, because we have a directive to deliver climate adaptations to our homes over the next 25 years. So it's something that's very, very much constantly on the table for registered providers of affordable housing in the UK. And equally, and I'll speak for my own workplace, but it seems utterly unachievable, both because of the conditions of the existing stock, which I will get into, but also because of the political directives, and the funding is non-existent and it's stressful, and it's not the core of my job. And cynically, I'm a little bit grateful, because my God, it's a big task. I think in the UK specifically, which is what I'm best positioned to comment on, we have very poorly insulated homes, generally speaking. We have issues with adding on either internal or external wall insulation to our existing stock, which is intrusive for customers living in the homes. It is costly. You have to get customers on site. You have to often then teach them to use the home, especially if you're using sort of more passive cooling or air source heat pumps. There are new ways of actually using and occupying your home. So we do find that you install an air source heat pump, you install external or internal wall insulation, and then our customers will understandably come back and go, it doesn't work. Sorry, because they obviously are using their home as they always have. And actually the way that you ventilate, the way that whether you open windows or not, and when you do that is impacted by these new sort of retrofit of the home. I think that's a really core one. I do think that another one is the uncertainty around the interventions that we're doing. So at the moment, for instance, our directive is putting air source heat pumps in instead of gas boilers, which is the norm in the UK. However, there's absolutely no way of knowing whether the air source heat pump will be the heating solution that will actually take hold as the new mode of heating. You're saying strong no, which is terrifying. So yes, there's a lot of kind of uncertainty in terms of whether or not we're making the right calls, and I suppose engaging with the technological knowledge that we have now, and whether that actually represents the needs of the future and the practices of the future. I feel like
I'm not going to speak about the heat pumps. No, don't. No, I said no before because we are in conversation with the associations of heat pump industry, and they themselves are saying that it's not a solution for the future. So in that sense, they know that they are not able to solve that problem by itself. I mean, for instance, you have to look to geothermal solutions, which is an urban problem, not a building problem. So it's much more complex. But I think that's not the item to discuss now. I'm very interested in listening to her, but I have been noting down certain things. If we speak about climate change and future energy problems, mitigation, adaptation, and we look to the privileged situation of the European situation, then at least in my head, there is no problem anymore in energy consumption by housing. It's solved. It's not solved now, but it will be solved in 10 or 15 years, let's say 20. Because of standardization. That's what Europe did, regulation. No? There is not enough money yet for rehabilitation and renovation. Yes, I completely agree. You speak with the banks and with the financial funds, and they say money is not the problem. The money is not the problem in this moment. In Europe, the problem is the social activation of you have to renovate your houses. That's and then there's something I noted down, and I'm saying since 2019, I'm repeating that constantly. The person who invented the SDGs, Paula Caballero, she said once in a conference, answering a question if she was happy with the SDGs, and she said, "Yes, I'm very happy, but I would add it one more." And she said there's number 18 missing, which is change of attitude. If you don't change your attitude, all the other SDGs will not work out. So in this sense, if you would like to rehabilitate or renovate, you have to change attitude in first place. I mean, it's not a technological solution or need on this moment. It is mainly a social way of instrumenting, forming information, convincing people. So when we spoke about standardization before, I think, and I noted it down when you were speaking, maybe we should go for standardization of adaptability, not so much standardization of functionality on this moment. If you speak about standardization of adaptability, that means that you have to understand that people every 10 years probably will have to change their windows because of climate change. When this happens, and people are understanding that you have to change every 10 years your facade, these materials should go back to the fabric, to the enterprises. And that means that you don't buy a facade, you rent a facade. And if you rent a facade, the initial cost for the housing goes so much lower than buying a house that automatically you have a financial solution of giving houses to young people, for instance. So it's a mixture, it's a connection of climate change problems, how do you manage it, how do you standardize, financial solution, technological, going back to resources, to fabric, and that's that chain. So but you can only do that if you change attitude of the sector. Yeah. And it's a very difficult discussion, and I think in Europe we're doing steps forward. Mm-hmm. Maybe we're not the best one, not always right, but I think things are making progress. If you look back 5 or 8 years ago in our situation, there were no international funds, there was no subsidies, there was no regulation, more or less. Now, 8 years later, we are where we are.
And I think it's so heartening to hear you. And you can sort of see in my notes, I've done air source heat pumps, future home standards, nightmare. We now have regulation. And my point is, I think we have to think about the different currents and timescales, that we have some long changes that are sort of there. You know, I work for a housing association, we've been around 100 years. At some level, the questions that we are having to address about the quality of the homes for people on low incomes and what they can, completely unchanged. And that is going to be exactly the same in 100 years' time. That isn't going to sort of like change. But equally, some things are changing fast, but they're not changing rapidly enough. So again, I mentioned the future home standard. This is a very poor piece of legislation we have now. We have been waiting for this for 5 years. It is pushing the whole industry into some very, very, again, shrink-wrapped directions and solutions, which really aren't going to sort of like have any attempt towards sort of like, you know, adaptability, flexibility. And I love the idea of standardising for adaptability. We should talk further on this because it's just, that's it. Because I was reflecting when I saw the question of what our challenges are. And yes, we have all these programs sort of like for insulation. We have all these activities we've been doing on the social side of the things that we've been doing, because we can't improve our homes fast enough, we're doing a lot of sort of social stuff. We've been setting up warm hubs where people, you know, if they're too cold, they can come together for social things, to get food because of food poverty, because, you know, cost of living, all these things are warm hubs. We had to pivot 2 summers ago to making those cold hubs. We were spending a huge amount of money, you know, getting air conditioning and things. And we're having to look at the programs we have, which are all about going in a particular direction, to suddenly say, actually, no, this isn't moving fast enough. Overheating is becoming such an enormous sort of like problem. The inflexibility, the point that you mentioned about sort of like water, we have huge problems because of the failures of our sewage systems, because of the way that sort of like our gutters aren't big enough, the way that we've designed balconies with little downpipes, so the water's all sort of like flagging back. So there we're getting sort of like damp and all these things because stuff has changed so quickly. So we need to have, and we've been pushing this idea of what do we do as soft retrofit before we get round to doing the big things, before we get a sense of, okay, how much, in which direction do we go, how do we cover it? There are all these intermediary things that we need to be doing sort of like first, because we have to be able to do those sort of like first, because otherwise, you know, going through this whole process of these big programs, we quite potentially could be making our lives of our residents sort of more difficult, more expensive, and end up with a bad long time solution.
Before, just because I like making things concrete and daily, I mean touchable, tangible. When you speak about adaptability, I'm always trying to look for existing systems who have to work with adaptability. And for instance, if you look to the health sector and healthcare and hospitals, they have always a certain amount of rooms empty because they have to be able to adapt very quickly to crisis situations. If you bring that to our housing discussion, then you could say you should standardize that in every housing block there are 2 apartments empty constantly, so that people can renovate their house very quickly, easily, 1 month going to the empty apartment and going back. Or on urban planning, they say if you do urban planning and you build 20 new housing blocks in a neighborhood, keep 1 constantly empty, so that from other neighborhoods they can come for 3 months, live over there and go back to the house when it's renovated. That's standardization of emptiness in adaptability. And yeah, you need space for doing things. So it's not so difficult to find these kind of things. You just have to look what's the need and how can you solve it, and where do you have the experience, even if it's another scale. I mean, a smaller scale or a big scale.
Wow, that was very interesting, and I really like also the idea of standardizing adaptability, and I believe there will be more time for continuing with the discussion, because now we're moving to the second block of this session, where we'll still be dealing with very much complementary and related topics. So first of all, we'll the name of the session, or this blog, is Resident Needs in Transition for Technocentrism to Adaptability in Housing Design. We'll have Noémi and Saskia. So we'll focus on challenges of building social performance, spatial sustainability, adaptive conversion, and retrofitting of buildings. So again, we're very much focusing on similar issues. So we cannot move?
So, hi everyone. I'm Noémi Gyárfás from Budapest. I'm doing my doctoral thesis at the Budapest University of Technology. In this short presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the spatial sustainability of apartment buildings in Buda, built in the 1970s. This is the first example I wanted to show you, one of the most outstanding work of the Eira. Besides it has a lot of architectural quality, but the most important one is its adaptability, and unfortunately it's going to be demolished very soon. So I want to highlight why I find that building and many others from the era so adaptive. One of the aspects I'm searching for is the placement and the positioning of the building and the massing of the whole construction. This one is the first terrace house of Budapest. These are some others from the same arrangement. I call them spatially sustainable because what made this mess is the mess was determined by the terrain, the view, and the possibility of developing an intensive connection with the garden. And I think these architectural ideas are valid on a long term. This one has a very special feature that it has a differentiated interior by means of level changes, which is the consequence of the terraced arrangement, and it made the usage much better in the long term. This one also has it's a varying of the dwelling with it's a rotated configuration with semi levels also because of the terrain. This one, the condominiums placed next to each other in a row, so all of the apartments can have a direct connection with the garden and the outside space, which is also, in my opinion, a sustainable spatial solution. The other aspects I was searching for is the flexibility of the floor plans. And the solution in many of the cases was that the kitchen and the bathroom was grouped in one small area, so the other spaces of the apartment could be used freely and can be adapted to the new usages throughout the decades. This is one of the examples for this one. This one has an even better sustainable flexible solution by moving this functional block to the side of the apartment. And now we are coming back to the building I mentioned at the beginning. It has the terrace mass arrangement and also the functional block in the middle of the apartment, which makes it very much sustainable. So I wanted to show you these examples and talk about this all because I want to highlight how important it would be in a sustainable point of view to recognize the potential of our old buildings and renew them instead of demolish them. Thank you.
So now we will move to our next presenter, Saskia Furman, also member of RE-DWELL Network. So the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Change the slides.
Yes, please.
So just
Ooh, stepping on the wires.
it's okay.
Hi, so yeah, I introduced myself this morning in the other room, but my name is Saskia Furman. I'm part of this RE-DWELL consortium, and what I'm going to talk to you about today is based on my abstract called Social Housing Retrofit Case Studies in Resident Engagement. This is kind of where I'm up to right now in my PhD, which I'm hopefully finishing this year. Please give me your feedback. I've got conclusions to write. So like I said, my name is Saskia Furman. My background is in architecture. I'm an architect, and I used to work in the sort of high-end residential sector, and then I left to look at low-carbon retrofit of individual houses, and now I'm taking that a step further and looking at social housing. The title of my PhD is Upgrading Social Housing to Meet the Socio-Economic Needs of Today's Dwellers, a Framework for Sustainable Retrofit. Whew, what a mouthful. So I'm also been working in Housing Europe, using their sort of network to interview people, which has created a paper. And Incasol here, based in Catalonia, the Catalan Land Institute, Pere is around here. And then I recently was with Eleanor in Clarion because I'm using one of their retrofit buildings as a case study, which I'm going to come to. So from the results of my literature review and my systematic literature review and my interviews and a thematic analysis, I've come up with these. This is the current results of my PhD. There are 3 key components to social housing retrofit to make it sustainable. And as I said this morning, by sustainable, I'm talking about holistic sustainability, social, environmental, economic, and cultural sustainability. The first component is the building, as you were describing earlier, looking at passive design, architectural solutions to heating and cooling, and non-energy benefits, which is of key importance because residents of social housing, residents of all housing, but particularly social housing, are much more interested in non-energy benefits of rehabilitation, renovation, retrofit than the energy benefits, which also kind of comes back to that question that we were talking about just before, on how to change habits. So if you want to change people's habits and the way that we occupy spaces and the way that people occupy their homes, you need to offer them something more than this is going to lower your bills or this is going to keep you cool. It's important, but it's not of key importance to them. So technology, again, as we were talking about, loads of benefits to technology, creation of green jobs, green energy, frameworks that standardize, things. But technology should be the complementary factor to first looking at the infrastructure that we inherit in existing buildings. And then thirdly, the residents, the users, the people who live in these buildings, they're usually from marginalised groups, social housing residents. They're already kind of starting on a bit of the back foot. And they have unique individual expertise. It's been coined in 1988 by Donna Haraway, what's called situated knowledge. So it's knowledge that only the people who live there can possibly have, and we need to extract this information in order to put it into design. So my case studies come from a variety of locations. They've got different strategies, different engagement strategies, different design strategies, and different stakeholders are involved. I'm mostly going to concentrate right now on the engagement because that's what my PhD is about, but they vary a lot. So for example, from one extreme to the other. So in this instance, the engagement strategy goes from extremely top down. The only resident engagement is really some workshops to teach people that putting on your washing machine is expensive. And then all the way to the other end, which is extremely bottom up, cooperative led, retrofit. All the decisions are taken by residents. It's a very labor intensive process, but again, gets a lot more streamlined the further down in the construction that you go. They even have some self-build in there. But at the end, it's led to a very successful project that there's not been tensions between the housing association, building owner and residents, because that's all kind of happened front-loaded. So finally, where I am right now, my next step is to organise a focus group at Clarion, at the Sutton Estate in Chelsea. This is it's in construction at the moment. And I'm going to attempt to answer the questions that are on board. I don't think I have time to read them, but go ahead and read them. Basically to try and understand what is the value in including residents in the social housing retrofit process, and how can residents help inform better than the top-down processes that we're guilty of throughout Europe, but especially the UK, but throughout Europe, because two of that very, very top-down case study right at the very beginning, that's here in Catalonia. So thank you. Is that on time?
Thanks a lot, Saskia. So now we'll follow the same way, like the same approach we had in the previous block. So we will try to answer two questions that were proposed by our PhD participants, researchers, and also our panel of experts. So the discussion this time will focus on innovative design. It's often seen as a very technocratic way. This becomes even more complex when you're considering the needs of not merely a single household, but a community and the spatial social interactions which underpin what we might consider to be a thriving community in that particular location. So again, if you can maybe scan that code and as the conversation flows, we can maybe write down some key words. That would be amazing. So the three questions we are focusing on is: what innovative approaches do we have to mapping these dynamic yet hyper-local situations? So it's more about methods, tools, ways of engaging with what's going on at the local level. Then what does it mean that a house is flexible or adaptive? And lastly, how can tools such as a focus group be integrated to support the decision-making process when retrofitting social housing? So maybe we can have some minutes to reflect on those questions. But if someone wants to say something right now, well, you.
Just while people are reflecting,
Yeah.
can I just add
Please.
something? Sorry, that last question comes from me because I forgot to say that I'm planning on doing the focus group by having a questionnaire, and then residents answer, or the participants answer the questionnaire individually and then together, and then facilitates a discussion. And I wanted to know, with your expertise in the room, how that might work for you, or what you think would be a really good, vital outcome that would be interesting to add into this. So that's why that question is there, and I'm really sorry I forgot to add it to the end of my presentation.
It's okay. Thank you very much for the clarification. So,
I think it will be difficult to have focus groups involved in decision-making process. I would say more as a part in the feedback loop, because we tend to use them to initiate ideas, finding gaps and so on. And sometimes we also use them at the end of the research process in terms of validation, testing ideas, and coming up with feedback. So I think you need to be very clear about what is the purpose of the focus group, and also given that you are approaching the end of your PhD, so it's going to come at the end, and it'll be incredibly difficult that they can be like a reflection of decision-making process in your particular case. But more broadly, I think there is the decision is when the focus groups will be best for a certain ideas development or project development. And I think I'm not aware of a focus group being very successfully integrated in decision-making process unless there is other experiences. And given your time scale, so you need to see how you can use them effectively as a feedback loop. Yeah, I look at you because it's your PhD and your question.
You said in terms of the time scale, I said this afternoon.
I mean, that wishful thinking, it could be possible. Yeah.
I think we have a reaction over here.
That's okay. I was just wondering really whether you have considered speaking to neighbourhoods officers, maybe concomitantly with this, or because what we have, at least as a social landlord, is some very, very skilled neighbourhoods officers that are, intrinsically. No.
There'll be people who will be in charge of the management. So, making sure that making sure rent's paid, making sure that grass is cut, making sure that they're the first line of contact if anything is going wrong, from ASB to sort of, your windows not working to the caretakers not doing their sort of like jobs.
Yeah, and additionally we have, yes, it might also look different with Clarion. So, but they also with us have really, really strong community ties. They know our residents really well, and we, as part of our different services that we offer a lot of kind of on the ground, like support and extra care kind of programs, and our neighbourhood officers would be really kind of cognizant of what is going on with each individual customer, what is going on with their home. So I wonder whether it could be, I'm not saying the focus group is not a good idea, but I think it might give you that meta kind of macro while still having that situated knowledge.
Yes. So my contribution to this question was, again, it's a real struggle I'm seeing internally and with lots of housing associations. We are so totally obsessed with the design performance gap and the building performance, and are we commissioning and building buildings and we're getting what we asked for? Are the retrofits, are they sort of like delivering it? That actually we're forgetting the how is it working for our residents? How is it working through that process, as well as how are the homes actually working with them? And again, we have this very, I think, limited fixed idea about what post-occupancy evaluation is. It's snapshots at periods of times. Whereas the sort of thing that you're describing with neighbourhood officers, and this is where I think we're remarkable, is you can actually start to understand how an individual's life is influenced by the changes in their home, how, what they need at that particular time, because our lives are all dynamic. You may need a bit of support at some time, you may need a different support at another time. That whole thing is really sort of like important. So that was the bit that was prompting my first bit of this question, is about how do we go from, again, this quite technocratic, here's the thing, how do you know if the thing is working, the homes, even the neighbourhoods, against that, how do you know that our communities are working, and how do you know that individuals are working them? And that comes on to this thing about what ways do we have to map these dynamic yet hyper-local situations? And we have so many conversations internally and with others about, well, we've got some really good data on this. We've got all these sensors and this bit of stuff, and we can track and we can give people sort of like videos and they'll tell them. And it's like, oh, come on. Maybe we have to go back to some really basic ethnographic relationship things, spending the time actually really getting to talk to people about what is important, because it takes time to build up trust so you actually get reasonable answers. And I'm really happy, and I was really interested. I so completely agree. Focus groups are amazing, but I think we have to be really clear and realistic about what decisions, where in the decisions it's reasonable to sort of start involving people. And I've been involved in several regeneration programs where it's almost too late by the time you've decided there's going to be a scheme. You know, you can do as many focus groups as you want, but it's not sort of working. Whereas if you have the opportunity to sort of, you know, either develop the design skills, think about actually the analysis of what does this place need with this group of people which are in the moment, and focus groups are brilliant for that sort of opening up exercise, isn't it? That opening up exercise. What they're also really, really good at is testing suggestions, coming back and saying, well, we're thinking about doing this or maybe this, how do you find? But having them as going, we have to make really hard decisions. You need a different sort of participatory structure around that, I think. And again, I think that's one of the things that we need to think about, all the different tools and processes that we have, and at what point in this big overall process we need to sort of like implement those. Yeah. Sorry, I can see.
Yeah. Sorry if this is a stream of consciousness. It was super interesting. I think what strikes me is that if I'm going to be critical of my own organization, then I think that criticism sits with my own department, in that we are not a large-scale developer and we don't have any systems for development. Whereas what we do have systems for is the bit that you've spoken about. So my colleagues in what we call the customer-facing colleagues are incredibly skilled and have absolutely tremendous and kind of well-documented knowledge of our customer engagement, which I think this answer ultimately is just going to support what you're saying, essentially. But in the sense that what we see when we do engage in a development is that the people that we engage first hand with in my team are the officers from the various different sectors of the business, and these officers have reams of knowledge about going from the individual circumstances, the names, the parents, the dog that passed away of each customer, but also to the maintenance issues that each house or each development estate is suffering from. And so our core engagement from a development perspective often sits with, in the first instance, our colleagues, in that they can often tell us what adjacent estates kind of are experiencing. Because, of course, the other issue that you have is that you can't engage with customers that you haven't moved in yet, in the sense that when you're proposing a scheme, you don't have those customers to engage with yet. They arrive after. So you have to engage with kind of case studies around in the area. So I think... or the wider planning system, which can be a bit impenetrable, yeah. So I think, I suppose I'm using it as a shout out to my colleagues who really do a very good job of this, and very happy to talk further about that as well, if you like.
I don't have so much experience in retrofitting, and I would just like to share one of the experiences I had 2016, 2019 as an architect, urban planner. I was in charge of the master plan of a new neighborhood in Valencia, 1,500 housing units. New development, and that's fit. I mean, what you're saying now, in which the promoter was really willing to engage future house owners or renters involving in the whole process. So we created a 600 members community of people interested in living in that neighborhood, and we created during 3 years in a participative way. How do you design a neighborhood? It's tremendously interesting, that experience. But what I learned about that is that, first of all, it's true, you can't expect from from inhabitants or from owners or for end users to take decisions. I mean, that's not correct. You can't. I mean, they look to you as a technical person who has the knowledge to give the decision, to give the solution. The most important thing is that from the beginning on, you ask them what is your main need and desire and wish. So they will make you the questions. It's not you who have to make the questions. They will give you the questions. And in the process of finding together answers, at the end, at least during these 3 years, all discussions, more or less all discussions, were about how do you want to live as a community in the neighborhood. It is not about technical solutions. It's not about how many rooms do I need. No, it's about how do we would like to live together in a neighborhood. And then they start speaking on, for instance, I use a car, but I leave in the morning and I come back in the evening. Someone else can use my parking place. So we reduce parking places. That's how do you share in community. How do you live together? How do you share things? Doing that process during 2 or 3 years, you have a common learning process of 600 people. And that's for me the most important thing of looking for a focus group or for a participant process. Not so much give me the solution or I will give you the solution. The end decision is not the most important thing. The most important thing is you create community during a process so that you have later on, when it's really done, a community ready to live together.
A really nice example of I have that. We have 2 garden villages that we're doing, sort of like in Norfolk and Essex, and the engagement stuff that is already starting, even though they're only at EIP, sort of like early sort of like planning stages, is we're doing so much work with schools, universities. We've got a sort of like a young person's design team, because they're the people who hopefully in sort of like 10 years time, when it's all sort of will be the ones who'll be living there. So I think it is possible not to just sort of say, oh, where are we now, but start to look ahead. And I did mention planning, and I think in the UK we have this idea about needs assessment and where should we be building things, and it becomes something which becomes set in concrete, and they are awful documents because we have to be engaging and making the places sort of like as they go. Can I leap on to what does it mean that a house is flexible and adaptive? Because I think that leads on, segues in beautifully to that we get so tied into what the planning is going to require us to do, or what actually even this current hyper-localised set of residents who are making decisions. And the big thing I would flag up is, if you have a focus group, you will have the usual suspects who will rock up to the focus group and they will tell you what they were really upset about for the last 15 years. And you go, well, didn't we sort that? Yes, but you didn't get it right. So, consider it. So I think there has to be, one of the things about housing and neighbourhoods being flexible and adaptable, yes, we have to get the spatial adaptability right. And actually, I think that's more about little tweaks. It's about having slack and little tweaks and adjustments that are possible. We have to have environmental, adaptability and flexibility is so sort of crucial. But the two that I'm really interested in, the 2 other typologies there, which are this idea of use flexibility and sort of like being able to sort of like have multiple uses around it, the co-living, the collective. What are the spaces that we're starting to do lots of work around having libraries of tools to get people to come together. The warm hubs or the cool hubs that I was talking about. It's actually about how do we give people opportunities to come together and sort things out, come up with their own solutions, sort out things that they need to do, but maybe it's a bit of a space, maybe it's and I think that sense of being flexible, and I love your idea of spaces for respite, stuff like this, being flexible about what we're actually using things to. But the final type of housing flexibility and adaptability I think we have to think really hard about is that social adaptability, that negotiation that goes on in how we use spaces, how we live together, how we sort of like change what we sort of like do. And I think if we thought about housing through that lens, what does it mean? What does it mean sort of like all to live together? What those bits of tweaks that we need to do? We would automatically come up with, places and homes which would suit people a lot better.
Thank you. Yeah, and yes, a couple of comments on number 2 as well, and a question for you, Noémi. Is that okay? Yeah. we should follow RE-DWELL language and change house with dwelling. Yeah, because I will tell this to Leandro later. So, the number 2. What does it mean to a dwelling? Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. I'm joking. I'm just joking. I think flexibility and adaptability. I think conceptually they're different. One doesn't mean the other, so we need to be careful there. So, for example, you can future-proof. What Lorraine was saying about lifetime homes is about future-proofing homes, so that if you have an aging population, they can remain in place, which is very important. Likewise, younger generations can live together without any issues. So I think for architects, designers, and politicians, future-proofing is very, very important. But sometimes you need to adapt existing housing. Like, for example, I live in a converted attic from a Victorian house, very large house, so I have very big attic. Krzysztof lives in a converted modernist building that was going to be demolished, by the way. It's an icon now in Sheffield. So you relate to Noémi's case study, for sure. Maybe we can give you tips how you protect it, how you can launch. So it has been converted, I think, quite nicely, part of it. But mine has been adapted, but I don't believe it's flexible because it's an attic. You have 2 flights of stairs to get there. So as you age, the knees will start causing you challenges and so on. Yeah. Whereas Krzysztof is much more modernist, lifts, and I think it's quite flexible. I would say more than mine. So we have cases that where one maybe the modernist future proofing kind of thing, and ours, which is trying to fix very old fabrics that actually they can be adapted, but only to a certain group of people, even of age groups, I would say. So not everyone can just go and live and climb stairs and so on. So there are issues, and I think we need to be quite clear which is which and for what purposes in terms of the occupants and residents and so on. Do you want to say something about your house?
Yeah, I see that I must. So sorry for being again critical about the British architecture. So sorry about that. Because it's a very interesting case that yes, the building itself that was designed, it's flexible. And even if it's a kind of concrete monster, it works pretty well. The problem is with retrofitting that, especially not the part that I'm living, but the next part, because it's a listed Grade 2 building. So there was a massive focus on how the building looks like, not what it does. And because of that, the second part, and in fact, Sophie Persmerker was my neighbor. We have been living together. And we have been looking through documentation, drawings for the next stage. And we knew that it's rubbish. In next 10 years, there will be mold because it was done to protect how the building looks like, but not what the building should do. So there's a good stuff in the building, but unfortunately the regulations and the kind of the narratives and discourses are leading this in a completely wrong direction. And I would, if I can, I would like. I love your example of learning, but I would like to kind of question this or put it as a potential tension. My own experience as an urban designer, practicing urban designer, I have been working with, in Belfast, in a very contentious religious community. So to me, I'm super sensitive and super kind of not allergic, but extremely careful when I talk about community, because communities could be nasty. Communities could be extremely exclusive, aggressive towards other people. So there was a kind of warning also here that, and I absolutely agree with Eleanor, that, you will get on focus group people that, they're always the same and they will tell you exactly the same things. And it's not necessarily what you would like to hear. So co-living and kind of living together, this is the way how we live together this is what the language that I would be using. I would kind of avoid the language of community, which is, kind of predominant in a kind of British discourse. Also in our school, we kind of love to talk about community. I'm scared. I'm personally scared of the word community.
So the question for Noémi, yes, that's a good point.
Yeah.
What are you doing to stop the demolition? Nothing?
No pressure.
No? You cannot create a group and lobby and stuff?
I am trying to explain how this building could be used, reuse them.
Yeah.
This one which I showed, I cannot stop the demolishing, but might help with other similar buildings if I'm talking about the solutions.
No, I was just going to say we should talk later about the work of Peter Tabori and Neve Brown, because that section is absolutely classic. And in terms of how you, I was thinking the similar situation with Park Hill, that we have these iconic buildings. We have Alexandra Road, we have the Hampstead Peter Tabori ones, and everybody loves them. And it is really hard to change and adapt them. And yet they are doing some absolute magic in terms of, integration, being tenure blind with, and I think we have to be really careful to know which is the contribution of the building. And I think there are some things which foster and encourage that encounter, that people coming together. But equally, what are factors around that social stability which were about who were the people who were moving in at the times, how they were perceived, and those social factors which are really influencing who gets to live there. So it'd be lovely to talk to you afterwards. We'll have some sort of examples of that. But I think, it's as I was saying with all of these things, it's how do we fit together those two pieces, the thing, the people, and then the systems within which they're sort of like interacting. And I think we have to look at each of those really carefully.
I was going to suggest you a fifth way of flexibility. It's one of these learnings that I had in 2016, 2019, when you discuss with these neighbors how you would like to live. And then they said, young families with kids, they said, I would like to live in the first, second, third floor, no more, because then I have control on my kids who are playing in the common space. And then you had on the same table older people saying, no, I don't want to be on the third, the second, or the third. I would like to be in the upper floor with my views and I. So if you can manage flexibility on how in one same building during your lifespan you can move from one floor to another because you have other needs, that's a tremendous strong element of flexibility in housing, because you renovate constantly generations in a building and you adapt not just physically by moving bricks or walls, but you move because of other needs. I mean, and older people, if you have elevators, I mean, accessibility is solved somewhere. But older people living on the first floor and having kids shouting there, I mean, that's probably annoying. So they would like to live upstairs. No, I mean, having that flexibility, then you have to have. But it's a question of standardizing management of a group of people in a building block.
The reason I'm waving my arms so dramatically, and I'm looking at Lorraine here, is we had this in England. We had sort of like the post-war stuff. Walter Siegel, who everybody will have heard because of his timber stuff, when he built Roehampton is a series of slabs and little maisonettes with sort of things of health. The way that was expected and planned to work would be people would move on to the estate, this beautiful tree, green, lovely sort of place, and they start out with their sort of like little couples, and then when they got their kids, they'd move into the ones with the gardens, and then they'd sort of like move up again. It didn't happen because we didn't have the social, the economic, the tenure, the management, the housing management clout and knowledge to be able to sort of like achieve that. And that's why Walter Siegel then sort of like did this huge volte-face and said, look, it's not going to work. I'm going to make the self-build housing. We're going to have to do it for ourselves. So sorry to have got so excited, but it's like, can we just turn the clock back? Maybe it was
not the right moment, the right idea in the right moment.
And actually, you're right, because again, they were bringing together ideas of system building. They were good. So maybe the thing is, we need the right time. We need the right time to think about this. Sorry.
I mean, I think these ideas in terms of design and in terms of conceptual idea, I think are really important and strong. But you then need the system of how people live in those properties, and particularly if people buy their own properties. And you know, within the UK, of course, there's been these kind of issues where there's social housing, and then it was people bought it, and so then that concept that you might have had about how people would live in that accommodation just wasn't going to work. And people also became territorial about this property being their property. So I think it's about the idea of how you design it in terms of architecture and urban design, but it's also about those systems you have in place. I don't mean to use the word community, but I will. The community that actually see themselves staying there long term and working with each other to think, well, I'm living in this community and I don't own this. I'm actually part of a bigger group. And I think, unfortunately, people think about themselves, you know, and how you actually create that sense of community is really important, so that people can actually invest in where they live.
I mean, I know people are understood. Just for losing what you're saying, I completely agree. I mean, more than the problem on being creative as an architect, if you would like to have adaptability or flexibility, it's a question of property management. And every day more, I'm convinced that our main problem in the housing sector is because we are still using a model of I need as a property a house. And that's completely wrong. If you speak with real estate investors, promoters, they always say the worst investment is buying a house, because you will be paying 2 houses in your lifespan, in your lifetime. So it's better to have a house and rent it than having a house and occupying it. No? So if someone who's investing in real estate is saying that, I mean, that says something. So I think if we go to a society where property on itself is not a value, but for instance, and I think in the Netherlands you have that system where you can be part of a housing corporation where you have a right to live for 99 years in your building stock, then you can start changing, and you pay every month a certain amount of, let's say, a rent, but a rent with a guarantee of living for 99 years in where you would like to live. No? So I think it's a question of being creative in how do we manage on a larger scale our housing stock, our dwelling. And then you can, next step, when you have solved that, next step is being creative on physical level.
Yeah, on property management, I don't want to be the negative person in the room, but yeah, people can decide not to live there. So one of the Neve Browns that Eleanor was just speaking about are amazing feats of architecture that yours really remind me of. And I think there are ways that you can try to save that building, and I can, we can talk about it, but there are ways that I've helped save buildings before. But people, those are social housing, and there's 10-year waiting lists in the UK to get on a social housing property. Sometimes people are offered this fantastic, modernist, flexible, adaptable building on Alexandra Road, and they don't want it because it's a different way of living. And we have a lot of unlearning to do as a society in terms of individuality, in terms of occupying an ownership, and all these property management. Yeah, that's one part of it, probably the biggest part of it. There's also, though, the fact that we need to completely change our model of thinking that has been systematically ingrained in us starting in the 60s, emphasized in the 80s, out of control in the 21st century. And that comes with changing attitudes and changing habits. And that's a much bigger feat than administrative, arguably extremely large, difficult administrative processes of changing the way that we manage buildings and move people from one place to another. But bigger than that is having people accept those changes, because nobody wants to live, at least in the UK for sure, but it's permeating more and more throughout Europe. People want to own their homes because there's a property market bubble. Still hasn't burst. We're not at the same financial situation in real terms that we were before the 2008 crisis, yet people just seem to think, and the governments have been pumping that idea with more and more money, but people just think that their property is going to keep going up and up and up and up and up in price. And we have a system of owners, individuality. Nobody wants to leave their little piece of square land that's mine, stake claim on this land. And it's so much harder than having really excellent, innovative ideas of how we can manage transitioning in your life through different buildings if you don't have the desire to do it, even when people have been on waiting lists for 10 years. Rant, sorry.
Just quickly. I always speak about this project because I find it's quite innovative. It's well based in the Netherlands, and it's very related to the property management issue. So it's called Patch 22. It's one of the case studies at the RE-DWELL webpage, and it happened during the crisis. So I think the municipality didn't have much work at that moment, and they accepted getting the challenge of dividing a floor plan in more division deeds that the apartments it would contain. Therefore, it was divided in division deeds of approximately 40 square meters, and some floor plans had 4 apartments, others had 2, others had 8. So the architects, from the architect side, they decided to place more doors than apartments would be. So some apartments would have a couple doors, but they would only use one. But that created the structure for that long-term adaptability in which you can, this was based on a CPO, so a collective property ownership, but you could sell some of your portion of your house to the neighbor or sell it individually, or that could be turned into your office, because it was as well a building that met the regulations of offices as well as of housing, which were different in terms of height. The services were running in a horizontal level, so the flexibility in those apartments is the maximum. So, but yeah, I interviewed the architect, and he told me that it was crucial that the municipality created this more flexible system of the division deeds. Of course, it creates more work because there's an owner that has 3 division deeds within its apartment, and it's receiving the taxes for 3. So the municipality has more work on their shoulders, but that provides the future-proof adaptations.
And we have, there's a lovely case. It's trying to do some of those things. It's only 4 stories. It's, again, divided up with sort of like artist space sort of like at the bottom, and then it has sort of like 3 floors, and where they've been able to have a very similar, how do you subdivide things with people living together, is they've recognised that there will be some people, they have 1 floor which is all about sort of co-housing. It not only has multiple doors, which made me think about it, multiple doors along the front, but it has potential to open up doors between apartments, which terrifies the living daylights to me. I would hate that. But what they have managed to do is they have managed to get their way around the fire regulations and have been able to have, rather than 1 access deck, they've had 2 access decks, 1 at the front and 1 at the back. And these are, again, big, generous, fabulous spaces. So they've managed to sort of get spaces to work twice as hard to be able to sort of like achieve something. And they've done it all within sort of like, really constrained sort of like local authority cost things. So we have these examples, but what it needed in that case was a local authority who would trust that a alternative approach to fire regulations, or in your case, the Dutch case, an alternative approach to ownership and ownership deeds could work. I think the way that we get more people to try these things out is if we can demonstrate that we are better at managing these places over the long term, and that's where I think it looks to us. If there are arguments at somewhere like House for Artists, how are they going to resolve it? If you can go and say, look, we think we've got a way that we can sort some of these problems out in the future, then people are going to feel more confident to committing to new ways of living. Sorry.
I'm just going to add one more thing, because it seems that we are fixating, or almost all academic debates fixating on, for example, the adaptability, the fixability, but we're forgetting also the adaptability and fixability for the nature and the nature resources. Meaning, how many days, Krzysztof, would you live in your building without electricity, water, and ventilation? Take this campus as an example as well. How many hours we could survive without mechanical ventilation, natural, the way that, so I'm trying to explain here, or to add here, that flexibility is the way we think about nature and how to integrate nature into our buildings. That's will definitely take us to another branch of the debate or way of thinking. So I'm gonna pass the mic for my colleague, Leonardo, to end.
Yeah, that was amazing, and I would like to hear a round of applause for everyone, because there were amazing contributions. So now that Mahmoud has made his magic, he went to Mentimeter, and we have created amazing visual representations of the discussions we just had. So maybe we can start with the first question we had, that it was just an icebreaker, and maybe look at the ideas we had before the session, and maybe those have, in a way, been transformed or evolved after hearing all these issues. So maybe we'll go through them very fast, or how would you like to do that?
If you wish to say some words. I think it really sums up what we have been discussing here, and the way that how we see innovation in housing. So flexibility, adaptability, definitely one of them. Community, the DDSS, design decision support system, a terminology I learned today from Karim. That's good. That's good. Then we move on. I think we can also move on and move to the second part, where it's a bit different, where we create a word clouds, or clouds of words or terminology for the things. I'm unable to zoom in, but I think it's readable somehow. We can help you read it. We're sorry about that. So if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we have quite a few concepts. So this is referring to the first block of questions we had. We have issues like standardization appears a lot. There is a standardization of adaptability, how we standardize for the 20th century, structure and flexibility, universal design, how to bridge the performance gap, individual needs, uncertainty about the future. So again, there is a lot about long-term versus short-terms, how we are adapting, and how legislation also adapts to what happens on the ground. They have the technocratic attitude that has, in a way, governed previous legislation and frameworks. And yeah, I would love to share with all of you later on these. Maybe it would be also good for you to reflect on it. So,
there was one which was vertical, which sort of said polyvalent. What was the significance of the vertical polyvalent? Okay. Sorry.
But indeed, is very relevant. Polyvalency spaces, very much linked to Herzberger. I know that you have worked a lot about his work. And then the second one, again, more related about methods and how engage with communities. So building trust appears in the center, I guess, and how we create those communities, although Krzysztof doesn't like the term. We have property management, a lot about managing, how we manage properties, how we manage tenures, how we manage renters and tenants, long-term engagement, and how we can develop those methods and techniques to engage meaningfully with people, and I would say in a long-term basis. And I guess that also brings us to the issue of resources and how we can better use those limited resources that, in the case of housing, local social housing providers, again, are very much limited. Talk to people and territorial, create community, security of tenure versus probably more orthodox or ways of home ownership. So adaptable blocks, and I think that comes from, instead of focusing on how to make dwellings adaptable, maybe we need to look for that adaptability in the housing block scale or in the neighborhood scale. Economic value versus use value as well. So what is more prevailing and what is more important? And there is one that is written, beware of community. So beware of the community. It wasn't Krzysztof. Okay. And yeah, understand how communities work. And I guess we all get the gist of that last part of the session. And I believe we're on time, right? Yeah, 5 minutes. So
before we thanking you and the close, I have one more question asking the experts that we have today. And the question is, what is your advice, like really quick, what's your advice for an early career researchers or people starting now doing the research on thinking and doing the knowledge transferability from academia to practice?
Oh, yeah. minute. 1 minute. 1 minute. Okay. I just have been absolutely thrilled to be part of watching sort of like this early evolution. But my advice will be, don't worry about not getting everything done at once. The sort of thinking you're doing now will bear you in really, really good stead for the next sort of like 20 years, the next 30 years, you know, looking at us sort of like, you know, some of the things that you're exploring now, you know, the solutions aren't going to be found sort of like soon. So actually, you know, don't feel it'll all be done and over and in one flash. You are in such a rich and fruitful area of discussion. There will always be the need for the sort of like thinking that you've done. I think the working with practitioners, anybody who's worked with me knows that you know, I work in practice because practitioners know this idea of situated knowledge, this idea of, you know, practitioners, we make theories, we do stuff, we sort of like act. What we don't have time to is sort of like reflect and think more broadly. You know, you guys have to be our external sort of like brains for that, to sort of like carve out that time while we're running and sort of like doing. You're the ones who can take the time and carve out the headspace for us to go, okay, so why did this happen? What were the things about this? Do you want to do this again next time? So always ask questions, always questions why we do things, and yeah, you'll have a great time.
That's an answer, by the way.
I'm not a researcher. I'm not a researcher. I mean, I tried to do my PhD 4 times in my life, and I never even started. So, I mean, it's not my way of working. But when I think on research and innovation, I always think that you shouldn't solve problems from today. You should solve problems that will be appearing in 20 years. Because then you reach on time. I mean, if you try to solve something from today, it will happen. You have your paper in 3 years, and that's too late. So, if you research and you would like to innovate and do these things, think on where will we be in 20 years. And when you have that attitude, and then I have two suggestions for researchers. First of all, nowadays, today, 2024, forget to think about the energy problem. It's not about in housing, in dwellings. Okay, it's not about energy. It's about comfort. Okay, why? Because climate change and energy consumption, the coming 10, 20, 40 years, is not a problem of the housing sector, but of the Internet of the Internet of Things. I mean, nowadays, ChatGPT consumes exactly the same amount of energy per year as whole France. And it exists only a couple of years, ChatGPT. Internet of Things is consuming everything together more than Germany and Japan together in every year. 80% of that energy consumption is because of the videos of little cats and dogs in our Instagram. 80%. So everything about heating and cooling systems in housing that you can solve with renewable energy locally is not a problem. The problem is comfort. How do you adapt comfort? People relate the energy problem to the people comfort, not the CO2. I mean, that's not the biggest problem. And the second is, and it's not your answer to your presentation, but don't be afraid of demolition. Don't be afraid of demolition. I love the project that you showed. They shouldn't demolish it because of the architectural quality, but that's an exception. I mean, if we would like to think on reducing resource impact, materials, and you start understanding the city as your future mining, then you have to demolish without any problem. And then you can do urban interventions on creating new green areas only because you demolish and you replace and you restructure and you reform the city. So the absolutely obsession of not destroying anything is a completely wrong thing. So we should be researching how can we demolish in an intelligent way. How do we recuperate materials? And that's, for instance, one of the images that you showed from these buildings, from these houses. Half of the image was the house, and the other half was a plant completely covering that house. I mean, it's related to the renaturalization of our cities. Don't be afraid that nature invades housing or buildings. It's all in that context of renovation, transformation is something from human beings. So in that sense, reusing, yes, but don't put a demon or don't be afraid on speaking about demolition.
Yeah. Like the circular economy in a sense.
It will never work.
What amazing advice, and also you're so quotable. It's terrifying. It's amazing. My thought in response to this question has to do with the pace of my workplace versus what I experienced when I was doing my PhD, which is very different. And so what my reflection would be is that we at SYHA have really enjoyed the work that you provided, Mahmoud, and one of the things that you did is that you kind of broke your findings when you did your secondment with us down into a very much a bite-sized report. Because one of the things we find quite often is that we get very heavy documents with loads of super interesting findings, but we simply don't have time to, the pace of the work that we do in practice is so very different. A to-do list for me previously might have been, ticking something off that I had achieved that week, whereas today I have a to-do list of 45 items in a day or in a morning. It's just very different. So I think one of the things that I've noticed that my team really appreciates is verbal presentations where you break down your findings in like a Teams call. It doesn't have to be like coming on site, or we also appreciate that. Shorter reports, typically our reports in-house are sometimes 2 pages, sometimes a long one is maybe 10, but that's kind of as far as we get. So one of the things that we have found, to be fair, not necessarily with Aya and Mahmoud who have worked with us, but in other academic engagements, is the impenetrability of the outputs. Yeah, so that would be my advice.
Thank you all very much for these wonderful advices and for being here in this session. I think all of us are tired now and we need food. So the lunch at 1, so we're already 3 minutes after 1. Thank you, and please give yourself a round of applause. And we appreciate it.